Welcome to On the Line. I'm Christine Williams. Coming up for discussion on our Viewpoints Hour, Afrocentric schools proposed in Toronto. Impaired driving charges dropped because a Spanish man didn't have an interpreter present when stopped by the cops. Stay tuned. And these are the issues we're presenting today to our Viewpoints guests for commentary. The Toronto School Board will vote soon on the proposal for Afrocentric schools. A judge has dismissed an impaired driving charge against a Spanish-speaking immigrant because there wasn't an interpreter present when police stopped him. And the Canadian Border Services Agency forced to back down from deporting a disabled Sikh man who sought sanctuary in a Sikh temple. Now let's meet our Viewpoints guests. Paul McKeever is leader of the Freedom Party of Ontario, and Dr. Anthony Hutchinson is executive director of the Brampton Neighborhood Resource Centre. You, the viewer, are our third guest. Feel free to call in at any time with your comments on any of the subject matters that we're discussing today. Now, that brings us to the first subject matter. It's been in the news for some time. They're talking about it. It's made headlines. Afrocentric schools in Toronto. There you go. Board trustees mull proposal for black school. Well, it's coming up shortly. Apparently the vote's supposed to be January the 30th, so it's around the corner. Now, to make a long story short, these are the basic sides of the issue. Proponents for it are saying, well, it's a great alternative because when you look at the dropout rate, we're talking people of African heritage here. We talked about this, Anthony. Who are they referring to here? Afrocentric schools. The focus is on black education. Once again, a huge dropout rate in the black community. So this is hope that if you have this type of a school, you're going to end up with more graduates. In fact, it's being modeled. In fact, the States has it, so we're kind of modeling after them. And from what this article says, you've got a high success rate. That's one component to consider. But opponents are saying, wow, it brings us back to that day of segregation. We want to know what your opinion is on it. Are you rooting for Afrocentric schools or aren't you? We're going to talk to our guests to find out where they stand on the issue. Paul, I'm going to start with you first on this one.
Well, you know, I'm not comfortable at all with, well, first of all, even tax-funded schooling, because I think it takes choice away from parents to begin with. But my concern is with any kind of school that says, and I think the curriculum and the idea in the school is to say, let's surround children or teens, depending on the school, with cultural artifacts and pepper the curriculum with heritage notes and history and etc. The problem with that is that students aren't being taught to think first and foremost, but rather just to learn a list of how other ways of living. And the suggestion is, well, here are some examples of black people who have been successful. You can be successful too. Aren't they a great role model? The problem is that a person's skin color is no gauge of your own personal success, whatever your skin color is. Just because someone in the past happened to have been smart and do something great, or was a murderer and did something horrible, doesn't mean that you're going to be great or you're going to be horrible. And I think when we set culture and tradition and history as the means by which we're teaching children things, we're getting away from just teaching them how to use their own mind and think independently. Break away from tradition and look to the future, not to the past.
Now, based on what you're saying here, because I want you to go over that maybe a little bit in more depth from the point of view of what the argument is here based on what's being taught in the schools, European history, instead of the holistic approach to history. There are other races. There's Asian history. There's African history, as well as European history. But the concern here is that you're seeing one side. You're seeing one side that's basically being paraded, being sort of glorified, if you will. And that's the argument, whereas the other side just, they're there.
Yeah, and it really depends on there's a mix of who wants these schools. There are those who are just looking for any way to help out children who aren't learning, and there are others who are much more ideological about it, who think that, logic is just one way of thinking. Well, it's not just one way of thinking, it's a better way of thinking. The fact that it came from the Greeks is largely irrelevant, and the fact that it came from the Greeks doesn't mean that if you're Greek, you're going to be more logical. We have to teach what's good in humanity, not what's good from the Greeks because it was Greek or from the Europeans because it was European. It's irrelevant. If someone invented a rocket ship, it doesn't matter that he was Scottish or African or whatever.
So we should incorporate what we see in history and include.
Yeah, we should be teaching children to identify what is finest in what the human mind can produce by applying their own rational thought to each problem, saying this is more valuable than that. Not because, well, you know, this is the way we've always done it, or this is the same color as mine, but this is what will be a value to my life.
Do you think we need to revamp the curriculum?
I think in all schools we need to revamp the curriculum, get away from teaching tradition and et cetera, and focus on how to think properly, how to value things.
I second that. How to think properly. I mean, it's a lost art. How do you feel about this, Anthony?
Well, I mean, it's such a complex issue in terms of where do you begin? I mean, if you're looking at it from an anthropological view of the evolution of humankind, you could probably trace it back to thought patterns originated in continental African regions. They went through the South Asian regions through Ayurvedic traditions, then they siphoned off into some of the longer Chinese traditions before they ever hit the Greek and Roman traditions. So we've basically bypassed, you know, hundreds of years, centuries that predated even, you know, the 500 AD of the Greeks and the Romans, on which a lot of our society is based. So I think, but whenever you take a label and you specifically target or segment one ethnic group or one racial group, like black-focused or Afrocentric, and you do that over a base of public tax dollars, you're creating a very slippery slope. It's no different than the faith-based schools debate. What do we, you know, maybe we should have Italian-focused schools, or maybe we should have South Asian-focused schools, or Chinese-focused schools. So what are we really talking about? The fact is, we have an implicit problem with learning in the Toronto area, is why this debate's coming up. And 40% of young black men in specific are not graduating. Not 40% of young black women or young girls. So we need to say, wait a minute, so is the solution, why is the solution not catering towards the black males, because the statistic is more representative of the young black men. So we need to look at some of the other factors that are contributing to this debate, and not just say, wait a minute, it's a panacea, because what you're doing is you're creating a division, you're using semantics, and I think we're using a smokescreen. I think racism is a big part of it. I think racial profiling by teachers. We sit here and bash cops in our society, a lot of people, for racial profiling, but I can assure you that the Ontario Human Rights Commission released a report in 2005 that blatantly states there's profiling against visible minorities in our school system in Ontario and against children with disabilities. And yet none of that that was a flash in the pan report, and it's never been addressed since.
Okay, I understand this whole, I think what the two of you are saying makes more sense than what I've seen in a lot of these articles that seem to only address it from a surface point of view. For instance, when it first came out, this was the argument I heard. Well, it brings us back to segregation. That's what they had way before the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King will be rolling in his grave. Well, it's a bit simplistic on that note alone, simply because when you look at segregation back then, it was a forced segregation. The blacks did not want to be by themselves. They were basically rejected by the whites, period. A very different scenario. But when I see the stats, for instance, in Nova Scotia, some fellow here, Mr. Fells, in this article that spearheaded an Afrocentric school there, talks about a 4% graduation rate from high school. When he started this Afrocentric school, it went to 90%. It seems like from the evidence presented, it's working, but I must tell you, I'm not comfortable with this whole Afrocentric thing. So I wonder, could it be an idea, because this is also being looked at as well, that you incorporate that kind of education in the current system? And to what levels do you do it?
Statistics are a funny thing. I'm a statistician, and you know, and you can do a lot with statistics, and oftentimes it's not the statistic but the story behind the statistic.
It's always that.
So we need to know a lot more than just saying that, because I think in terms of what his success was, we know, you take something like the Hawthorne Hawthorne effect, where if you take a group of kids and give them special consideration, they're going to do better. Just
because they feel better. They think they're worth it.
Yeah.
They think they're worth it.
Now maybe if you took, we did a program in northeast Toronto in Malvern where we took 8 young black men who had been unjustly labeled as developmentally delayed by the Toronto District School Board. We put them into a transitioning program with the support of the Toronto Catholic Board. And those young men who were all proud D&E students, you know, were scoring 80, 90, and 100% in their math scores. It was so powerful that, of course, Alan King, the filmmaker, did a documentary that was featured in the Film Festival in 2006 about the success of these young men. Well, you know, when these young men were able to get this alternative curriculum, which included Mensa problems, and they were doing it, well, what was part of the success? Well, there was only 8. We had 1 teacher, we had about 4 teaching aides, giving them all kinds of support to do it. So when they had the support, when they had a smaller cohort to learn.
It takes a lot of resources to do this, though.
Well, possibly, but then with resources, aren't we about equity? Aren't we about, like, this is part of our accessibility, you know, trying to make things accessible in our society. And so I think, but in terms of if we have, now when you have a class with 30 kids and you know, maybe you have 3 or 4 who are disruptive, well, it's a lot, and the classroom size is too big. It's very difficult for the teacher to cater to the, you know, 3 or 4 who are disruptive. So it's easier to send them to the office and get them in trouble and get them expelled, so they don't graduate. You know, but again, what's it really about? And at the end of the day, I think we need to look at.
There are deep social issues, though, affecting the, if you want to put it, the African community, or roots. If we're looking at, particularly in Toronto, we saw the report that came out, a 1,000-page report, that there's a serious problem there with violence. There is a problem. I mean, some say they're not the problem, that perhaps it's society, it's racism. You hear people saying as well that you've got a large segment of this population that their dad isn't even present. I mean, there are issues here that I still think we need to address, and I'm not sure that the Afrocentric schools is necessarily the answers, but we're going to be talking more about it. We also want to hear if you're in agreement with Afrocentric schools. We'll be back after this. Stay tuned. Again, welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. We're continuing to talk about the proposal from the Toronto School Board in Afrocentric schools. We want to hear what your viewpoint is. Call in at any time. Let's go now to Lizzie on line 5. Hi, Lizzie, you're on the line.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
My comment is that I think that we need to keep the history in all schools, and for everybody to learn everybody else's culture so that we all come from there and understand it. I think separating doesn't help everybody. I think that's the problem, that a lot of people don't understand each other's culture. And I think if we understood it a little bit more, that it would help that. I work in a multicultural job where I have to learn everybody else's religion, and I think it helps me to respect their.
Yes. Lizzie, you got a good point. How would you receive this? Or would you perhaps have certain stipulations here? When you get into other people's culture, when you get into history, let's face it, facts are endless. How do you go about picking and choosing what you put in a curriculum so that different groups, perhaps those who most need it, can be pleased, can feel as if, well, wait a minute here, my legitimate history is being recognized?
Well, I think that's a mistake. You know, my legitimate history is the first mistake in the whole thing. It's all of our history.
Well, everybody's history is legitimate. The reason I said so is because you got to pick and choose.
Right.
So how do you go about picking and choosing?
I think what you do is you say, look, this isn't the history of the blacks or the whites or the Greeks or the Romans. This is the history of humanity. And what we're here in this classroom to do is to say, what out of all of human history is the valuable, the stuff we want to keep?
And that's what makes it legitimate.
That's right. I mean, in art, for example, there's a joke by one of my favorite authors. She says, once you've seen one group of people clapping hands and jumping up and down, you've seen them all. And I looked on the internet, and I saw literally dozens of paintings of people in a circle dancing and jumping up and down. And I thought, she's absolutely right. There's absolutely nothing innovative or value-adding to this. It's just another folk drawing. And what she's saying is, look at art, try and identify what's valuable in art, and everyone, regardless of color, should be able to do that regardless of the source of the art. In other words, whether you're black, white, or whatever, you should be able to look at any piece of art and say, now that's good art or that's bad art, regardless of whether it's
You know what?
my art.
You're not
or
going to get
your
an
art.
argument from me, Paul, on that particular model. I think it's fantastic, but you got a problem in Toronto, and that's recognized, which is why this was proposed in the first place. You've got a serious problem with violence, with kids dropping out. We know that a little while ago with the zero tolerance policy on violence, the NDP came out and said it was a gang recruitment act. It seems to constantly point and identify one particular group, the gangs, and we know what we're talking about here, hence the Afrocentric schools. We're not going to be politically correct. That's the issue here, which is why we're looking at this as a possibility. My question to you is, with the problem we have at hand, we want to see what's best for these kids. A kid doesn't choose to be born and say, look, I choose not to have my dad or to have a ghost dad in the picture or a deadbeat dad. It's something that's happening. We've got a problem on our hands in the Toronto School Board. How do you handle it?
Well, I don't claim to be a teacher, but one thing...
No, but just common sense here, from a politics point of view.
Sure. Well, one thing you don't do is assume that, you think differently if you have a different color of skin. We're all human beings. We all process information.
But with unique needs according to group.
Well, depending on what your group. I mean, if you're talking to someone who's mentally challenged, that's a different matter. But if you're just saying, well, my skin's darker than your skin, I don't think that skin color is a need. I think that morality might be a need. Maybe somebody's completely messed up. That means every child, regardless of skin color, should be taught, how to live a fruitful, happy, peaceful life. And that's information that's not just relevant to people who are having a hard time, but to people who are having a good, So if we're teaching these things properly, then every school will be an appropriate school for every child. If on the other hand we're saying, well, this is just a different way of behaving, there are better ways of behaving and worse ways. And until we're willing to say that, we're going to be setting up little balkanized tribes of schools where the blue-eyed white kids are going to say, well, we have our history and we can only learn in a blue-eyed white school, and how come they're getting more funding in the black school than in the white school, and we can all start fighting about funding and who's got more, and then it can be a nice racial war, and we can all turn ourselves into the Balkans. So it's a horrible approach to divide people according to race. Race is the most irrelevant thing in human history. Consider what's valuable for all humanity, that is the rational mind. Teach kids to respect rationality and morality, and it won't matter what the color of their skin.
I hear you. Anthony.
I think that when you're addressing the issue of Afrocentric or black-focused schools, you need to say, why are we even talking about this? The whole reason why this topic has come in the public forum is because of social problems that are occurring.
Of course.
The social problems that are occurring is that 40% of young black males are not graduating from high schools in the GTA. This is a very local and specific issue. Now, there are other local specific issues that occur with Aboriginal populations in Canada as well. And so we'd have to look at those and say, but wait a minute, they're in Aboriginal populations on reserves and so forth, and they're having barriers there.
According to stats, 70% of them are actually outside of the reserve and integrated, which a lot of people don't even realize.
Yeah. So, but the people who are in the reserve are themselves facing barriers of not finishing schools. Okay. So, and I think the statistics are higher for those who are not finishing schools when they're in their marginalized areas. So we're not even talking about that in terms of, but for some reason the 40%
well, it's the violence issue as well. I mean, that is part of this. I mean, this has been ongoing. So how do we fix it? I mean, yes, go ahead.
Well, no, and I think part of it is we need to look at, well, what are the causes of a problem? I mean, you talk about a logic model. We need to go back and say, wait, what are the underlying causes that have got us to this place? I mean,
family breakdown, alienation, racism is an issue as well.
Lack of morality.
That's right.
And I think, and we could say, well, lack of role models or
precisely, all of them.
But but I think that what we need to do is we need to say, look, the people who are in the positions of leadership, whether it be teachers or community leaders or politicians, need to be very transparent of how they are addressing what we're dealing with. This is not a curriculum issue, right? We're saying, well, if we just have a more, we're going to solve a social problem by having a curriculum-based issue, having maybe some teachers who have more black teachers. Well, I can assure you that the people who made the difference in my life were predominantly white. Okay? The people who impacted me, who assisted me, the professors who were my mentors, who helped me, the people who gave me a step up in business, the one man, Fred Lepkin in Burnaby South High School in grades 11 and 12, who made that impact in my life and helped take a kid who was going in 180 degrees in the wrong direction and changed my life, was an obese, sorry Fred, white Jewish man. So, and how did he teach me to read and become passionate about learning? Through Bob Dylan lyrics, through Bob Marley lyrics, through all kinds of the lyrics from the Police, and that's how, through music lyrics, I really began to build my vocabulary and learn to read and become excited about learning.
You were fortunate to have somebody that took you under their wing, and a lot of these kids, they don't think anybody cares about them. I mean, that's a huge issue. Let's hear what you on the phone lines have to say. Yolanda on line 8. Hello, you're on the line.
Hello.
Hello.
I just want to share my little problems with the audience. I have a son, and he's 17 now. When he just came from the Caribbean, I registered him to a school here, and he was going so good until they started to label him. Then he started to drop back from school, don't want to go in the morning, and he will go to school late. I will get a phone call that he's not coming to school.
So, Yolanda, you're saying in short that he suffered racism and this affected him?
Yeah, and
Yolanda, you made a point there. You made a good point there. Because of time constraints, we can't go into a lot of detail, but that issue of racism, and of course, we'll continue to talk more about Afrocentrism and to hear what centric schools and to hear what you have to say on the phone lines after the break. Stay tuned.